Hello, welcome to another one of our videos, and this is an update on Piriformis syndrome, and I'm doing a couple of videos on this. I did one recently about VMO and knee pain, just because of some of the videos that I had from over 10 years ago now that are still very popular, but a lot of the information that I was provided then, obviously there's since that time, and with experienced better research and just working with lots more people, come up with better ways of doing things. So while many of those things are still very similar or the same, there's lots of things that I do now that are better. There's things that I maybe don't do that I was then, and things that I'm doing now that I wasn't. So now one of the very first things I ever do with people is I want to determine if the symptoms are really piriformis syndrome from some hip problem, or is it really a back problem. So just doing observation of testing and simple, like obviously this is one way to reproduce the pain. So because you're basically trying to find the trigger, and from something simple like this I can really observe how they move, and if it's like really a herniated disc that's creating sciatica, or if it's really a hip problem. Obviously you would really want to have MRI or X-ray or additional things to probably guide you on this, but really observing how the person moves. This is a basic hamstring mobility test that we're sort of using only on one side, but it's better than just lying on the floor and stretching their leg. I'm really observing how they move, how they bend. I want to see how much lumbar curvature they have. Are they trying to use their hips at all, or are they just bending entirely through the spine? Things like that. All right. Secondly to that, I really need to know. Sometimes, like the piriformis is due to weakness of especially around the glutes, but also feet and other things as well. And other times it's due to stiffness. So there could be overworking and the muscles tight. So the symptoms though will be exactly the same. So what this means though is that the solution is entirely different. So what may work for one person, say like stretches, foam rolling, all those sort of things, may be very useful in releasing the stiffness that it helps them to regain control of the hip joint. But in the person who doesn't have any stiffness and actually it's weakness, the stretching, foam rolling and all that stuff actually makes everything so much worse. So before you do anything, you really need to use a lot of tests and that to determine if which is the case. Obviously how the injury started, looking at repetitive movements, all those sort of things are a real key to this. All right. So I'm going to take you through a couple of simple things. Understand there's stacks of stuff that I have leaving out just because this video would go for like an hour. I want to try and get this covered off quickly just to give you an overview of my reasoning behind the method of how I'm trying to find what are the best sources of exercises to use. So obviously this is not a good exercise. This is just one that reproduces the pain, and trying to find the trigger and determining, okay, which way I may want to go, where I might want to look a bit more. So let's have a look at some of the mobility things that I might use. So I always start with mobility, right? So it's always the easiest place to begin. It really gives you a lot of clues, and you can tell. So this is a thoracic mobility, and everyone thinks, what the hell has that got to do with the hip problem? It's got everything to do with the hip problem if this thoracic region is really locked up, which is extremely common. The lumbar spine and the hips are going to be really compensating and sacrificing a lot of their movement in order to provide the lost mobility that you don't have at the thoracic spine, which really should be a very mobile segment to give you like movement for walking and that correctly. All right, so these are just simple tests that I use to observe if there's anything wrong. So that first one, probably more shoulder based. This lower part is where I often see issues of the piriformis or hip and back related things. And Dylan's got good mobility here, so he comes right around, and you can see like that full range of motion here. He's almost like 180 degrees. He started there, moved all the way around, so he's got like all of that range. Often what I might see with someone who's really quite stiff, and I might find it only on one side, I might find that they get stuck there and they just can't get any further, where the other side goes this way. So they have this real loss of range of motion from here to here, and that range of motion will feed. So if this is this left thoracic region, it will feed across into the right hip, All right, so I'll often see that this, it's hard to say, did this cause that or did that cause that? It's hard to say, but you'll often find that there's a real issue there, and if I don't address that, or whatever I'm doing at the hip may have little chance of succeeding if this is left untreated. All right, so I want to eliminate that as a concern and move on to the next thing. All right, now this is also where I might be able to start seeing if the person really has a weakness or stiffness. So like I mentioned before, if they're a person with weakness, they'll see them pass all these mobility tests, where a person with stiffness will sort of be really bad at all of them. Now this is obviously one that will reproduce pain. A lot of the time there'll be a huge amount of stiffness in this hip joint on this side, so through the glute region, so they may not be able to move very far at all. If they do though, it tells me that, like I've just mentioned then, that it's not stiffness that's the reason for their pain. So all of my stretching and that, I'm really going to be very cautious about using it at all. If they got stiffness there, I might be thinking, okay, this could be useful, but I don't really know enough yet for sure to be certain of that, because that also could create pain. I just know that there's something really limiting their range of motion. All right, and again, I want to look at left and versus right, really looking for differences, asymmetrical differences, because they tell you a lot. So if they have a dramatic improved range of motion on one side, I'm thinking, okay, this could be a useful thing to use, or I might need some easier variation of it because it's too aggressive. I may be looking at other things. All right, so this is a very important one because I'm looking at the hip mobility. So I've looked at thoracic mobility, I'm looking at hip mobility, so with a basic stretch, trying to rule out if it's that or not. I also may go into the next stage where Dylan's showing us here like more of a moving mobility drill. So this is sort of moving in and out of external and internal rotation. So someone who passes that stretch test, I may ask them to do this to see if they have control. And this sort of is a basic stability test. So there's some sort of role of stability involved in this. If they pass both of these, well, I really know it's like lack of strength that's going to be my concern. The person who doesn't have the flexibility will never be able to do what Dylan just did then. All right, that'll be way too difficult for them. All right, I also can get a rough indication if they have a severe loss of internal rotation. All right, so then I might be looking for trigger points. Again, this is sort of tell me, I don't really want to use this so much to actually roll on, so it's not really a corrective way of doing things, but I'm using it as a testing way. I really don't like rubbing on the piriformis itself. I find it just puts more pressure on the nerve and it's just extremely painful. However, I might find it useful to roll around through the top of the glutes here, and especially through the TFL where Dylan's going to roll through here. So the front of the hip, I'm really looking through the front of the hip if there's massive trigger point. Again, looking versus left versus right, because often it'll be one side that'll be significantly compromised than the other. And everything's a test in the beginning. I'm just looking for tests. Some of the tests become the exercise. Sometimes the test is too difficult and I need a variation to make it easy, but it tells me that I need something there. That's what I'm really using these for. I'm trying to look for information about what's going to be used early on before I try to strengthen anything. I don't want to go straight to strengthening. If I go straight to strengthening, I'm really going to be forcing the body to compensate even further. I may create more pain, or I may create a new injury. Using the simple hip and quad stretch, so obviously this is a real big problem one for knee pain, but can actually tell me a bit about if they've got like a loss of range of motion through the front of the hip as well, how much their quad dominance may be contributing to their problem, which will be creating inhibition of the glutes, so the glutes will have no chance because the quads are just dominating every movement. Again, I might see that quite a lot with sacroiliac joint problems, extension-related back pain, which is sort of very similar to the piriformis syndrome, the same sort of muscle imbalance and compensation, creating pain at different areas, but very similar sort of testing results. All right, so very simple exercise, but very effective in telling me where I might want to go next. All right, so there's some of my simple mobility drills that I might be looking at, or stretch tests that give me a bit of information. And the last one, I might be just looking for an ankle one. All right, so again, this is often more of a problem with knee pain, but if there's a severe loss of ankle mobility, I'm really going to be very suspicious of foot stability. All right, so and foot stability could create huge amount of problems at the hip, even though the feet have no pain themselves. All right, so make sure you check the links in the description below, because there's heaps of additional information on other ways that I might be doing things, and what I might do if I find something wrong with the ankle or the hip itself. All right, so these are just ideas. Again, there's stacks of other things that I might use, but to save time on the video, I'm just going through the brief one so we can give you the overview. All right, so let's move on to the stability component next. Okay, so the stability exercises are quite simple, and they need to be, because I'm really using them again as tests, and some of these are great as exercises as well. So this first one, this is really a great way to test the glutes and the core together. And often what I will see with the piriformis syndrome is either cramping in the hamstrings immediately, or a severe loss of the pelvic being aligned. So you can see Dylan's doing this quite easily at the moment. So it's just basic bridge test. So as they're coming up, he should be able to hold it still there, and then his pelvis, what I'm looking for is his pelvis remains perfectly level. If the side where his foot lifts up drops considerably, or he cramps in that hamstring on the side that's holding him up, if he cramps there, I know the glutes are not strong enough. They just either can't do their job, or the inhibition is sort of forcing the extra overload into the hamstrings. So this is a great way, and obviously testing a bit of the core stability here as well, because the core is definitely involved. All right, so this would be an example of where we might see a sort of a failure. See how so Dylan's obviously exaggerating this, but you'll see how that hip dropped considerably because his right leg here wasn't strong enough to hold him up. The oblique on the opposite side not working in tandem with the glute. All right, so obviously a great exercise to regain control. It eliminates foot stability as a problem because you're very stable on the ground. There's no compression on the spine or the hip joint because you're lying down. So all these lying down things are great ways to start. So when people are in a lot of pain, these are often my first choices, along with the mobility things. So I might be using some foam rolling and some of the things that we just discussed a minute ago. Now, one of the very things I want to do very early on is improve bending actions, because just like herniated disc problems and back pain, the poor bending and use of the hips inhibits the glutes from firing, creates enormous problems through the spine, but obviously it creates quad dominance and glute weakness, and all of those things contribute to the problems that we'll see. So this is a great way to use as an exercise very early on before I try to stand. So I'm trying to actually encourage them to use their glutes to bend forward to create the hip extension. So when they're bending forward, they can gain good control here. So if there's a lot of sciatic nerve tension, they won't feel it when they're kneeling because we've broken the nerve, all right? So it's broken at the knee here. So they can really get this bending action in this kneeling position that may be near impossible to do when they're standing. And here I can get them to feel how to do it correctly, so keeping that perfect lumbar curve as they're bending forward. So see Dylan there keeping that curve, as opposed to bending entirely at the spine, which creates disc bulges, huge amount of tension on the nerve. All right, so he's learning to keep his pelvis in neutral, and then when he comes forward, he's learning to actually activate his glutes to come forward. So that point there where I don't want him to squeeze his glutes hard, but he's learning to use the glutes to do this movement and not using sort of hips and quads and all that sort of stuff. All right, so it's a great exercise in the early stages to teach that person, because very early we need to get them to do this standing. So that's a less aggressive way, and that's something that I didn't use early on years ago. And the band is really useful. It gives them the feedback on how to do it correctly. Really can make a huge difference. Now, this next one, obviously there's a lot of progressions of this. I'm showing you the progression just to save time, but there's ones that I might use on the floor. There may be the hydrant exercise I might use with some people, the BOSU for stability challenge, but obviously I want to get to this one here with the band. This really is a great way to build some strength into the glute max. And again, because I'm on the floor, I'm horizontal, I'm not creating any compression. And it eliminates the hamstring cramping stuff that we saw with the bridge. Really, the hamstrings are quite inhibited in this movement. They really can't do a lot. I also get incredible amount of core stability and core strength through the abdominals from doing this, but the resistance on the band really forces his glutes to provide that hip extension. This is a real key exercise along with that bending one we just discussed. I'm getting like that, so in this case this right glute's working with that left abdominal. Alright, so this is a lot of people don't like this one because it is quite difficult to do, but it is extremely effective in the early stages in regaining some postural control, developing some glute strength on a small scale to get to the bigger ones that are going to be much more difficult to do. Alright, so the horse stance one, again check the description below because there's heaps of links to the additional information on the other variations that I may use depending on the person and how severe their pain or problem may be. This last one, this is a side plank one. Again, it's quite a simple exercise, but this kneeling variation, it's a great way to regain some core control, but also hip stability, like we saw with that bridge before. Because we're working in the frontal plane here, really obviously brings in a huge amount of strength into the obliques, but also the hip itself. I love this kneeling one because when they head back to the floor, like his head back there, they're in this sort of bent position like they were when that we would see in a deadlift or squat. So you see how he's broken like that, and so to come up he has to push his hips forward, which gives us that glute sort of activation feeling to create the movement. So it's again being lying, there's less compression. Obviously they're going to feel a lot easier on one side than the other. So I can really do a lot of stuff here with very little. Great for herniated disc problems as well because the spine is not flexing or extending, so we're not moving in that sagittal plane. Right, so great exercise. I might only use 5-second holds on that. So I'll just come back. I might only use little 5-second holds, not too long so they don't fatigue too quickly, but can be an excellent exercise in the early stages when the pain is quite severe. Alright, so now that we've got mobility and stability out of the way, we want to move to the next thing, which is really learning how to bend standing up. Actually, before that we want to look at some foot stability. Alright, so let's have a look at that. Alright, so before I head into the standing movements, we want to just rule out any basic foot stability problems. So I use like simple exercise for the big toe, and there's some little band one, like we want to rule out if there's excessive pronation or flat feet or even rigid ankles, which you might have seen on the ankle test earlier on, but using some simple exercises like this to create and teaching them how to create foot stability through better activation. So check the description below for more information on this because I'm only just going to go over this quickly. But this will sort of give me a chance to move on to other exercises like this one. So I might be using things like, if I've got flat feet, I'm just ruling out plantar fasciitis and stuff like that, and trying to use different variations of exercises to improve their foot stability. So again, there's a lot of things I might use, but this was something I was probably ignorant to early on. I'd probably looking so much at the hip and the core and the glutes, but as just with time you realise just how important the feet are to the activation of the glutes and mobility of the hips even. So if there's issues at the feet, I want to get rid of them. So working with some basic stability things here, like I've shown with Melissa here, showing us how she might do that. Again, the big toe is a big part of the equation, so we looked at a simple drill before, but I might use things like the balance beams here and even the sensor mat. You can, in the description below, I'll put the things on additional exercises, but really teaching this person how to gain good foot stability control, which will dramatically improve how much they can use their hips to function. You have no idea just how valuable doing things like this can be barefoot, so without their shoes on, learning how to activate their big toes and all of their toes to create the stability and even core control. So you can see how she lost it there. Really great ways of, in the early stages, that'll help enormously when you want to get to the strengthening stage to come. That'll make the biggest long-term differences. All right, these things can be really useful ongoing for a long time, and yeah, you'll rule out any of these issues coming from the feet disrupting any of your work to try and be done at the hip. All right, so don't underestimate how powerful these can be. All right, so now let's look at some of the standing exercises. Okay, so this is one of my favourite exercises when I'm doing deadlifts. And remember we did the kneeling one before. I want to get to this one as soon as I can, the standing one. I don't necessarily need to have this huge load on it. I could just have the bar to begin with. I might even just have a kettlebell and they're not even picking it up. But this banded pull, and now from the assessments, and obviously on the side that we know that has the pain, we're going to use this band as a way to test what's going on, because you can see how it's pulling him to his left-hand side here. All right, so the band's pulling quite strongly here. Now, in theory, this left leg should be the one that's going to be tested, right? So the glute on this side is going to be pushing away to avoid this resistance. The obliques and the QL on the opposite side are working to also make sure the shoulders stay square. All right. Sometimes, though, I see it's actually the problem on the other side, even though the pain may be this side. It could be weakness on the opposing side that's the problem. All right, and the exercise itself will tell you that. So it's a great as a testing way, and the test doesn't lie. All right, so I'll use this very early on, which is another thing I didn't use many years ago. And also this is the Romanian deadlift, so when we really want very little knee movement, it's all hip. All right, so there's very much a stretch through the hamstring. The glutes are the key, and so is the core. All right, so learning this banded one is probably one that I'll be using all the way through the entire program, and I'll only be using the side that sucks. So I want to find out very early which one is the worst one, and then I just stick with that one for ages, because eventually it gets me to the one leg one, which is going to make the biggest change. All right, so but that comes with the highest risk. Now there's another version I use, which is the uneven one. We'll have a look at that. All right, so this is the uneven deadlift. So obviously you can see the weight is only on one side, and it's a great way to activate the core. Very similar to that banded one, but just a different feel to it. I probably prefer the banded one, but some people I might find this is quite useful in really developing their ability to control their core stability with their breathing. Again, I might find which side is going to be the worst one out of the two, and just stick with that one only. All right, and eventually I'll get to the dual loaded deadlift with it even on both sides, and obviously my main intention is to get to the one leg stuff. If I get to the one leg stuff, I'm going to really change everything. All right, so this uneven deadlift is a great way to just create that evenness through like trying to balance up the asymmetry. And again, the greatest test, you can see how he has to bend there. This is a great visual of this Romanian deadlift. So his shins are quite straight, getting a great bend at the hips here, but his lumbar spine's in neutral. So you really should be feeling the glute and the abdominals a lot on this one. Right? The load doesn't need to be very heavy. This is only a 10 kilo plate. That's all. I would never really go much more than that, regardless of the person. Maybe with some females 5 kilos may be enough. All right. So, and I don't need them to lower all the way to the floor. Probably just past their knee. You can see here, that's a good visual of how far he's bending over. So it's identical to the one we did before, that was kneeling. All right. So great exercise very early on. Great for nearly all types of hip problems, this one. All right. All right. So now let's look at some of the stuff that we're moving into, more of the strengthening stuff now. All right. Let's have a look at those. All right, so now we're at the stage where we've developed, from mobility, stability to the bending patterns with uneven deadlifts, banded deadlifts, and they've got demonstrated good control. I want to really get to the single leg stance standing, and this is where the foot stability is involved, and obviously tremendous amount of hip stability. So I'm going to start with the simple thing being this toe touch drill, which I've featured many times on this channel before because it's such a great exercise. Very simple, but can be extremely difficult for that person who's got all types of hip problems. So basically, Dylan's just trying to go around around a circle around him. So there's like 6 or 7 points that he's trying to reach to in multiple directions, and every single one of them needs to maintain perfect control of the lower limb to maintain its perfect alignment. So you can see there. So he's got like this perfect straight line between ankle, knee, and hip. all right, so that we don't see any collapsing in or the feet pronating, the body compensating too far, any one of those, and you'll fall over anyway. But we're just demonstrating, can he have good control without needing a tremendous amount of strength, because there's not a great deal of range of motion. He just needs to be able to get in multiple directions. So the leg in the air is also very important, because this is where you might see the mobility restrictions, especially on the side ones where he'll reach out. They might have real issues with the TFL cramping up through the side of the hip here, so he might not be able to reach out that far. So that'll be where the mobility things are getting in the way. Obviously the stance leg is where the strength is more involved. So you can see like he's got really good control through all of these movements. All right. So reaching in that full 360 degrees. All right. And this is where we get a massive amount to move into our next phase, where we're going to be moving into the single leg strengthening type of movements. All right. So the toe touch drill really highly underrated by many people. All right. So let's have a look at the next one. Alright, so I'm just going to bring this up a bit. Alright, so this is where we're going to move into our more of our single leg deadlifting type things. Alright, so this is where we've gone from our banded deadlifts from before to more of our single leg stuff. Alright, and Dylan here demonstrating how to get like that beautiful action. There we go. So we've got that nice sort of hip action here where we see that nice lumbar curve that he had earlier on in the two leg stuff. The hip is really doing a tremendous amount of work. So this one leg one is really the key. If I can get to this one as soon as possible without creating any trigger points or extra pain, I'm going to make a tremendous difference. All right, and obviously starting with body weight to eventually adding dumbbells and extra load to create the control. The sooner the person can get to developing these sort of skills and the strength in this movement, the sooner you start to make huge change. Obviously this is a lot different to the two leg ones, because the foot stability gets involved more. Alright, so obviously you're going to see a lot of people lose control here, almost falling over all the time, just don't have the control. So that foot pronating in, maybe the shoulders collapsing on one side, maybe the hips sticking out one side, maybe all of the above. Right? But the sooner I get to this one, the sooner I make some massive changes. All right. Now, when I go to adding load, one of the first things I'll do is add this uneven feeling to it again, a bit like what we saw with the barbell earlier. All right. So where we'll have the one kettlebell, and instead of like holding it, we'll try to pick it up. Alright, so Dylan's going to show us here. So it's like a contralateral side. So if he's going to pick this up with his right hand, he's going to be standing on his left leg. Or if I think he's going to go right leg, left hand. Alright, so right leg is the working leg and the left hand is the working arm. So obviously this is a bit like a suitcase carry that we'll see later on. This again is the load is really trying to force him into, like we saw that uneven deadlift before, the load is actually trying to force him to make the mistake and fall out to this side. So the stance leg's got to work way harder, as do the abdominals and the QL, to create this symmetry to be able to execute the movement without falling. Alright, so quite a clever way to really develop the strength that you're looking for that's lost, and really learning how to gain massive control through the glutes and the entire system on how to execute this movement. And once it starts doing that, the piriformis stops working too hard. But you've got to be real careful. You can't rush to these exercises. You do these too soon, you're going to create massive problems. All the things we've done prior to this are really the key. All right, so you can see how he doesn't have the hip problem, so we see great symmetry on both sides. All right, for just people with no pain, these are difficult exercises to do. All right, so they're great strengthening exercises in their own right for preventing problems. All right, so now once we've done that, we want to move on to integrating the hip into the rest of the system with other movements. So let's have a look at quickly look at those. All right, so we're up to the last stage. Again, there's a lot of things. I'm not covering all of them, but just some of the main ones. So we want to look at basic pushing patterns. So single arm push, very similar to what we just looked at before with the contralateral side. So it's a different action, but the legs are the stable base here, so the arms can do the work. So he's in more of a split stance, like a lunge position here, and pushing through the left and then also the right. We want to observe if there's issues with stability, how his feet positions, how he controls his stance, the strength he can generate. This will be very much an anterior sling exercise, so all the ones we looked at previously are posterior sling, but we don't want to neglect the value of all of them. They really need to be working in common. This also brings in the thoracic mobility that we looked at right at the beginning. All right, so these are where we start to strengthen it, and not just using stretches, we're using everything. All right, so obviously the opposite to the pushing is the pulling, so we're going to look at like how we might use a single arm pull, and then moving into variations of this where we all of these have different variations. This will be the simple version where he's just standing still, which is opposite to what he was just doing with a push. So that stance leg is this where the posterior sling's involved. The strength on it's not that great. The strength on it dramatically improves if we start to bring in like lunging patterns, which is what he's showing here. So now the strength dramatically improves, and this is where we might see people start to fail. Maybe the hip mobility on the trailing leg's an issue. Maybe the weakness sort of comes about once we start into that lunging pattern, but really sort of developing the strength across all of the different integrated movements, so combining arms and legs, and really exploring all these different patterns of movement. The main one with the legs is obviously the bending one. That's where we make the biggest difference, and it's always these ones that will come in last, like lunges and squats and step-ups and things like that. But your key to it really is the bending stuff, the deadlifts with 2 legs and then eventually 1 leg. All right, but these are really great exercises very early on for creating the strength in the areas that are often going to be a trigger for that person. All right, so next one we might look at is the wood chop. So we want to look at simple versions of this to begin with, so not really looking at too much leg strength, just really getting this nice kneeling position. Again, this is I could use this very early on, this one. Really gaining some control through the obliques, getting good hip release on the back leg. This will lead into all of the single leg stuff that we've looked at so far, and also the suitcase carry, which will follow straight on from this. So this is where the strength in the legs isn't that important here. Control of the pelvis and the spine and getting good mobility through the thoracic region is. All right, so very simple exercise. They're very effective for moving forward. And then our last one we're going to look at is the suitcase carry. The great one for all lateral pelvic problems, weak glutes, all those sort of things. Again, to pick it up requires the deadlift action, so it's sharing the deadlift, but it's actually better than that because it's got this gait pattern. This is when we're actually on the move. So the uneven thing that we've seen several times in this video is at play again, but now we're on the move, so it's a little bit more difficult to control. So we're looking at how he controls the glutes on one side with the obliques on the opposite side. If the bar starts moving around, his body starts moving around, there's a loss of control. All right, so this is a great exercise. Again, this is not really even an exercise. This is really something we just do in life. All right, so where we're carrying things is just something. Even to get in the gym, like to carry your dumbbell to where you want to work, you're going to need to do this. So either you're doing it well or you're doing it poorly. All right, so you're really looking to see if you've got this beautiful control. You need a decent amount of weight on this to actually force the body into doing the right thing. If it's not heavy enough or the challenge isn't great enough, nothing will happen. All right, so that's another one I wasn't using early on many years ago that I do now. All right, and it makes a huge difference to a lot of the hip people I work with. All right, so that's quite a lengthy overview. It's a lot longer than I was expecting, but as you can imagine, this injury is quite complicated. It can really be other injuries looking like this and really send you on a wild goose chase. So hopefully I've given you a lot of information here about where I might go and how I gradually progress to slightly harder things. And the slightly harder things make the biggest difference, but they come with the biggest risks. So it's all about minimising the risk to find the best way forward. All right, so again, check the description underneath for more information, and that should help you, guide you on where you need to be. All right, I'll see you on our next video.